what had actually happened is both of my legs had been crushed. My left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged. My rib cage had been all banged up. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been completely torn out. And then the seatbelt had cut through my lower abdomen, my intestines, and ruptured all my insides.
Jeez.
I was a mess.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Welcome, everyone, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today, we're pleased to have on the show #1 international best-selling author Jeffery Olsen and his son, Spencer Olsen. After a horrific automobile accident claimed the lives of Jeffrey's wife and youngest son, he found himself out of his body and later experienced an NDE, as he himself was on the brink of death. After over 18 surgeries, Jeffery began his road to healing physically and emotionally. His book, Knowing, details his miraculous story. Jeffery and Spencer's newest book, Where Are You?, is written from Spencer's recall of those childlike observations and captures the feelings, questions, and sorrow surrounding loss. It also sheds light on a healing journey that opens a deeper awareness and connection to those we love who have passed. Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for coming on.
Gosh, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, and it's good to be here.
I guess to start, and I know I was curious because, you guys, you've done so many interviews and you've talked about this so much. Does it wear on you to have to recall kind of on one side, miraculous, amazing story, on the other side, very traumatic and painful? And I know, there's a way your mind can turn things on autopilot to where you can talk about something, but you're not like necessarily feeling it. You're not like in that, but whereas like maybe you lay on a pillow at night and you can kind of like, you're in that moment again, and it's much more emotional. I've had that with my father who passed away. I can talk to people now about it, but like if I sit by myself and I don't know, just your brain clicks in a certain way and it's like, my God, I'm like feeling it all again. Do you guys still have that, or can you now talk about it and not have to deal with that?
Well, it still happens. And yet that's a fantastic observation. It's been 25 years since the accident. Now Spencer's joined me in speaking just in the recent, last few years, but it's I still cry. We'll get into it. Who knows? And so I always get a little bit nervous because I don't, the emotions may flow, and it is a miraculous story. But I think the interesting thing with having Spencer here is I had the miraculous out-of-body near-death experience, and so I kind of come from that mystical perspective of, wow, I experienced something more. They're not really gone. Spencer, however, and he was only 7 at the time of the accident. He comes from a very literal, he didn't have a near-death experience. He didn't have any of that. He was just a little boy who dealt with grief and loss. And so it's kind of nice to have him here. So there's that balanced perspective of, not so much the near-death experience, but the life experience. How do we get through all that? But yeah, we might cry and the emotions still come up, but it's been 25 years and it's gotten easier to talk about it.
Yeah, it's definitely easier. And if I may step in, Dad.
Yeah.
Those emotions will come up regardless. Maybe on the anniversary, I'll be feeling a little melancholy. But I would hope that we may get a little emotional, just that we're getting in touch with those emotions and we're recalling events from the past. It would be less authentic if we weren't emotional. But yeah, I think it's better that way to really get in touch with it. So, can you give us a rundown of that day? What happened? What led up to the accident, and then kind of getting into the story of yourself, Jeffery, and then we can go from there.
Yeah. So let me kick that off, and I'll kind of share my perspective, and we'll let Spencer share his perspective of that day. We were on a family vacation. Spencer was only 7 at the time. It was me, my wife, and our 2 boys. Spencer was 7, and Griffin, our youngest, was just a toddler, 14 months. And we'd been on a family road trip, a family vacation from northern Utah to southern Utah, actually visiting family. So it was it was a tight-knit family road trip. And it was on the way back that the accident happened. Two things to share about that. And I often share these things, but I think they're important. As we were pulling away to leave, we'd said our goodbyes. I buckled the kids in their seatbelts and car seats, and we got in the car to pull away from the curb. and there's Tamara's parents, grandma and grandpa are on the porch waving like they do. And my wife stopped me. She said, wait, stop. I thought she'd forgotten something. But when I stopped the car, she ran up to both her mom and dad. And I noticed this. Now, on a normal occasion, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But in hindsight, she asks me to stop the car. She runs up to mom and dad. And I noticed and watched as she not only hugged them both, but she kissed them both. She hugged and kissed them. And then she came joyfully running back to the car. And, here I thought she had forgotten something. And it was just, I want to go say goodbye one more time. And the reason I bring this up, I think we all get those little whispers in our lives, those things that just, hey, I want to do that. And she stopped me, she did it. And in hindsight, what is so critical of that is that was the last goodbye, for her and her parents and how that played out. The accident happened on the way back driving. I had the cruise control set at 75 miles an hour. That's as fast as I could legally go. And I lost control of the car. There was reports of crosswinds. There was reports of a red pickup truck. I think one of the difficult things for me, and I couldn't talk about this for some time, I may have dozed off at the wheel. I may have just nodded for a minute, not like fallen asleep, but just nodded because I recall the car swerving to the right. I overcorrected to the left. And at that speed, that's when I lost control of the car and it began to roll, not off the road, but down the road at that high speed. And I'm driving and Spencer's a little boy in the back seat. Spencer, I don't know what you recall about the situation at all, but we have two different perspectives.
I was going to say, I don't know how enlightening my perspective will be, but, I was a 7-year-old kid just playing with my Star Wars action figures. And then before I knew it, I think I remember the car swerving and then my mom yelling, Jeff, and then going to grab the wheel. Either she or him went to overcorrect, and then we just started tumbling down the road. From there, he was pretty panicked, kind of in a very amygdala fear-based state, just swept up in panic. And I just remember my dad saying, it's going to be okay. And then from there, I was just, I don't know if it was 5 minutes or 2 minutes, but what felt like an eternity, just waiting for, the rest, the people to show up, the ambulance and all the paramedics. And then from there, just getting and being put onto the ambulance.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, Jeffrey, but I think you mentioned that you had kind of like, I don't know, blacked out is the right word, but you don't remember the actual rolling portion.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Do you, Spencer? I mean, do you remember, can you because it's hard for people to envision who haven't been in any kind of insane kind of accident or something. Some people say time slows where it's like, man, these things are crawling. Other people say you don't even remember any of it. How do you remember that?
So very interesting. Visually, what I remember is just everything being black and red, which is kind of morbid, I guess, but that's kind of what I remember. Just, I guess, not clear, but black and red are the colors that come to mind visually. But yeah, in addition to that, just time slowing down, moving very slowly. And then I remember I was later told that what I explained it as a kid was that it was like being beat up by a boxer or something. But part of that shock really helped kind of numb the pain. But yeah, just time slowed down, kind of black and red colors, and just starting to spin.
Yeah, and I blacked out for that. In fact, I blacked out, and it was when the car came to a stop, that the first thing I heard was Spencer. He's just a child. He was 7 years old, crying in the back seat. And my first instinct was, I've got to get to him. I've got to get to my son. But that's when I realized I couldn't move. And I seemed to be pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. I couldn't tell. I mean, I knew we had crashed. I was then acutely conscious. And my first thought was, get to your son. then I couldn't move. And I was unaware of the injuries. The adrenaline must have been incredible, because what had actually happened is both of my legs had been crushed. My left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged. My rib cage had been all banged up. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been completely torn out. And then the seatbelt had cut through my lower abdomen, my intestines, and ruptured all my insides.
Jeez.
I was a mess. Now, when I heard Spencer crying, I was like, it was that cry. It's like, he's okay. He's okay. But that's when also I was aware, and I knew at the scene that no one else was crying. And I became very aware that Tamara and Griffin were gone. That I knew that right there at the scene, even before the near-death experience. And yet it was in that dark, horrible, funny you say black and red, Spencer. I mean, for me, it wasn't a visual color. It was just the grief. I mean, the shock, the trauma, the guilt. I mean, I was driving the car, and I just kept thinking, can't I get those 3 seconds back? And yet that's when, I had this intense experience.
That was really difficult when I read that, or maybe I was interviewed, because I've read and watched interviews with you and talking about not hearing your youngest son crying and knowing something was wrong. And I think for most parents, you can relate to that on the superficial level. Like my son was in the pool the other day, and he was basically starting to drown. He had drifted too far into the water, and he started going underneath, and he couldn't yell for help. And it's just that silence where something's wrong, and it's just your gut drops. It's just a terrible feeling inside. So I can only imagine what you were feeling there. And it's just so upsetting to even just hear that, articulated by you. And so sorry you had to deal with that.
Yeah, it was a horrible thing. And I mean, and I don't, I'm details here again, I don't know. One of the most disturbing things is what I was aware of is that Griffin, our youngest son and Spencer's little brother, what had happened is the car seat had broken apart, and he had been ejected from the car. And I knew that. And I didn't see anything. Mm-hmm. But as you say, boy, the heart of a father is just like, where's my little boy? What happened? And it was a knowing, just like the title of the book. I knew he was gone, which was the worst feeling. But also, well, at least he wasn't, broken apart like me somewhere on the side of the road. And I don't even want to really, yes, you can ask me anything, but that's the morbid, horrible thing that I couldn't even talk about for a decade.
Yeah. I totally understand.
Something kept me from looking right to my left to see his absence in his car seat. And I don't even know the first time when I was made aware that he was ejected from the car. I must have been an adult or hearing, my dad retell our story to find that detail out. I guess was kind of saved or protected from that information as a kid.
Yeah, that's rough. My dad was a police officer, and so he would go to he was tasked with going to either fatality car crashes or just a lot of horrible stuff, and sometimes children were involved, and it's just like, I mean, terrible stuff. So I mean, it's probably good, Spencer, that you don't have those recollections in your mind. I mean, for you, is it as a adult now and a child then, you always wonder how much does a kid retain, how much goes into their subconscious, how much are they traumatized by it, and I'm sure we'll get into all that in more detail. But for you, do you find it easy to just, like you said, black and red and things are kind of abstract? Is it not in clear crystal detail, or is it kind of a blur to you in terms of the initial aftermath of the wreck?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's funny you kind of say it was viewed through an abstract lens, because it's like there's bits and pieces that are clear, but I don't know. I'd have to kind of almost walk through the whole experience, and yet I don't know if I could ever piece it all together. Yeah,
I think for me too. I mean, the details are the details, as I've said. The emotional part of all of that was so overwhelming. that the details kind of get lost in the trauma, and maybe that's a good thing. I think that's really keen. That's probably a good thing that we lose the details, and yet we can hold on to the emotions, and yet it was in that horrific situation that beautiful things happened to me. And I say beautiful because I can say that now in at this point, 25 years after the fact.
Could you go into that a little bit in terms of, so you, I guess, blacked out for the role and then you woke up and had all these feeling just pinned?
Yep. Blacked out. But it was in that moment of terror, really. It's like, wow, I've got to get to my son. I can't move. Oh my gosh, half the family's gone. What just happened? And the guilt and the grief and all that went with it. And that was the point when I felt light come. I mean, literally, it felt like light rushed to me and embraced me or surrounded me. And it felt as if I was rising above the accident scene. Now, it's really, when Spencer said I spoke to him, I remember that. I remember trying to calm him, even though I couldn't move. And I said, it's going to be okay. And my first thought was, that's a lie. This is not okay. I was losing consciousness. I was aware that half the family was gone. But that's when the light came. When I said, it's going to be okay. That's when I recall the light coming and this lift, this rise. And in hindsight now, I believe my spirit must have left my body. Because suddenly I was fine. Suddenly the pain was gone. I could breathe. And I was confused. I was thinking, how can I be okay? How can I be okay? And there was this light, this tangible light comforting me. And then Tamara, Spencer's mother, my wife, suddenly she was in the light with me. And we began to have this conversation. And it was an intense and yet profound conversation. As she kept saying, you can't come, you can't come, you can't be here. You've got to go back. And we literally discussed the fact that if I stayed with her, Spencer would be orphaned, and I knew he was okay in the backseat of that car. I learned a lot about choice in those moments. Yeah. There I was looking at the woman I loved more than life. I mean, there aren't words for that either. And yet I knew I had a little boy in the backseat of the car and I had to make a choice.
Would you say, because you've used a word, I think I've heard you say this before, is you felt the light come, not see it come. So it wasn't a visual thing, it was more of a sensation, or how would you do? I know it's hard to describe these things when people ask, like, hey, how was this miraculous, supernatural experience,
It's a great question. It would be far more of a feel. However, once in the light, the physical sensory, and I wrote about this in the book. I mean, there's my wife and she's actually emotional. She's crying. It was really odd because I was comforting her and she's crying saying, you can't stay. You got to go back.
I was going to ask you this, because it gets interesting about, and I know it's maybe impossible to answer, is like when you talk about this consciousness and being outside of it and leaving your body and time and how all that plays, and how long has she been outside her body, and has she accepted the fact yet that that's happened, and is she upset about it? And I wanted to ask you about, did she seem as upset, or was it more about getting you to do what you needed to do?
Well, and that's a great question. And all I can do is tell you my experience. It was interesting because she was emotional. She was upset. And when I talk about, like, I felt the light, but then suddenly I could see her, I could hear her. But the senses were awakened in such a way that it's like I could taste her words. I could feel her tears. It was just easier. Yeah. She seemed to know she was staying and I was going. It wasn't like, let's decide who goes back. She was like, you've got to go back. You've got to go back. You can't stay here. And as the whole thing played out over the years, I had insights down the road, years. And I'll insert that now simply because it came up, but that was so confusing at first. And then as the years rolled by, I was in the hospital for 6 months, I had 18 surgeries. But I finally got better. I had to stay in my brother's home. Spencer was taken by my younger brother and his wife, and they just took him into their home while I was in the hospital. But as life moved on and down the road, when I began to I was back at work and I had hired a nanny. I wasn't dating, I wasn't looking, but Tanya, my current wife and Spencer's current mother, it sounds strange to say his current mother, but he's had two moms.
Mm-hmm.
When I realized I was having feelings for her, I felt guilty about that. And that's when Tamara, my first wife who passed in the accident, she came to me, and I didn't see her, but I felt her. I felt her presence, and I heard, not with my ears, but she spoke to me. And she literally said, I loved you enough to go. We had a contract. There was a bigger scheme here. And I at the time I was angry. I'm like, you loved me enough to go. And that doesn't make any sense. It's like I'm limping around attempting to raise our son, and yet she explained to me, this was what we agreed on. That my soul in some weird cosmic realm wanted to come and experience this. And she loved me enough to leave, to go, that I would be opened up in such a way to expand. And that probably still sounds crazy as I explain it, but the way she conveyed it to me, and even supported the fact that, yeah, I know you're having feelings for another woman. You should. It was almost, she was like, you're a pretty good dad, but you're a lousy mother. And my little boy deserves a mom. That was the conversation.
No, that's a good way of putting it. You did kind of open up some stuff I definitely want to talk about later, because you're talking about like the soul and the decisions to come and things, and stuff I definitely want to get into, but not to detract you too far from the story. So when you're back and you've had this conversation with Tamara about you have to go back, what happened after that? Did you struggle with that? Were you tempted ever to be like, hey, I know my son's crying, and I know you have that parental pull to go and take care of them, but was there any part of you that was like, it's got to be mind blowing in hindsight, that your wife is there and it's just so much to handle.
Well, it felt like a choice, and yet at the same time, I knew I was coming back. It's almost like, yeah, there was a soul's journey that I knew I was coming back, and I knew that was the most profound goodbye I'll ever say.
Mm-hmm.
And when we made the choice, and when I made the choice, I'm going back, I literally found myself wandering around the hospital. When I say wandering around, in spirit, I was moving about the hospital, and I have no concept of time. People did arrive at the scene. They were able to see the Spencer. I had to be extricated from the car. And then my injuries, I had to be life flighted or airlifted to the nearest level 1 trauma center. I didn't know any of that. I knew that we had crashed. I'd said this profound goodbye, and then I found myself moving about a hospital, seeing the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the families of the patients. But I was seeing them in such a profound way that literally changed me. It didn't matter who I saw or what they did or hadn't done. I was seeing them as these beautiful, divine beings, and I was connected to all of it. Everyone I saw, I knew their love, I knew their hate, I knew their struggles, I knew their challenges. For instance, a nurse passed me, and they seemed unaware of me, but I felt in a moment, I knew I knew, it's like she was me, I was her, we were one. I felt the abuse she had received as a child. I knew how that made her feel. And yet in the same instant, I'm like, wow, look at this magnificent person. She's in a hospital working to heal and help and support. So there was this, and that's just one little, everyone I saw, there was this connection to, and there was this oneness that really changed me forever. Judgments and comparisons just went out the window.
Did that last a while? I know time is probably very skewed in that sense, but do you remember that occurring for some time, or was it kind of a brief transition as you found your body?
It was brief. It was brief because when I finally came to a body that I didn't feel that weird thing from, I was just a body laying there. I thought, well, that's strange. And that's when I stepped closer and looked and thought, wow, that's me.
Jeez.
But it wasn't me. Like I was having this profound connected experience, but there was my body, and I was out of it. And I think that was probably the realization, for lack of a better word, wow, you're dead. That I'm not in my body. That was That was shocking.
Now this gets into kind of some of the. I just recently, I don't know if you are familiar with the gentleman, either one of you, but Bernardo Kastrup, and have you heard of?
I don't know him. No, I don't.
He's been done some stuff with DOPS, and Dr. Edward Kelly, who I talked to, had mentioned to have him on. But basically, he approaches it as consciousness is all like one, and it's like the base layer of reality, and then we're in fact all God, and it gets very like just kind of mind blowing. Do you feel like, and I don't know your guys' religious kind of affiliations before this happened and then after, do you feel like there is more truth to the fact that we're all part of God versus, distinct entities roaming around, and this is why maybe you felt that interconnection with these people you're passing in the hospital?
Yes. Bingo.
I mean, I've practiced like a lot of mindfulness meditation and whatnot, and the idea of the self and getting rid of that can be scary. I know through like the use of psychedelics, you can have.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you guys about that.
But yeah, I'm very open to the idea that we're all one, and it's hard to accept that and like get rid of yourself, but. Mm-hmm. True to me.
Yeah, and that I experienced it. That's what you're explaining. And I know Ed Kelly. He's a fantastic guy. I love Ed. And I can't even fathom the depth of his research because it is mind-blowing. But I experienced that. We were one. There was a oneness, there was a connection, and there was a divine a divine essence of all of us, of everyone. And I experienced that.
Yeah, it's hard for me, and because I've had struggles with. I was born and raised Catholic, and I've kind of had struggles with the aspect of suffering and pain and how that relates to everything. And I still would describe myself as a Catholic, but I've had a shift in that belief toward more of a, and I guess you'd maybe describe it as an Eastern religion type, one kind of like Spencer was saying, and so. Has it really changed your guys' approach to religion? I mean, I don't know what it was before, but how do you approach it now?
It has for me. In fact, Spencer and I were talking about this recently. I mean, I grew up in a conservative Christian home. It was Bible and God and heaven and hell and judgment. And I believed that life was a test. Mm-hmm. But not Tanya, my current wife's good Catholic girl from Minnesota. We compare notes all the time on religion. But it was this thing about judgment and God and fear. And although I had been taught of a loving father, but it didn't make sense. Well, why would a loving father send me to hell over, now I look at it and I just kind of shake my head and think, wow, but things shifted drastically for me from religion to perhaps spirituality and connection. And it's not like my faith went away. Mm-hmm. But my faith literally transformed because it was more to the near-death experience, but it transformed my faith into absolute trust. It's like, wow, we really are loved. We really are divine. We really are part of the oneness. And it changed my feelings and my viewpoints in many ways and expanded them in drastic ways, which when I say something beautiful happened, that was part of the beauty of it. It's like, wow, I never had any idea. I was wandering around like an ant in kindergarten and had no idea the beauty of the connection, not only between each other, but to everything, including the divine.
I probably was so underdeveloped as a person that there was kind of like this structure that was changed after the accident that I was aware of. And so I'm sure, my upbringing would have been a bit different if we hadn't had that experience. But, I had to develop more as a person and go through adolescence and become an adult before, I'd kind of solidify my religious beliefs anyways. So.
Oh yeah, totally. You're not going to be 7 like, hey, now I'm Zen master meditation, Do you guys, and not to you don't have to get into like for lack of a better term, political nature of it, but do you feel like religion is a net positive or negative in how it's kind of practiced today? Because when I was talking to Bernardo Kastrup, he was upset about how religion has morphed into kind of more of a judgmental control mechanism than it was about the spiritual connection that it used to be. He felt like more. And how would you guys view that?
Yeah, I would agree. However, I have nothing against religion. Religion, if it brings us closer to the divine, great. That's the purpose of it. Now it can be dividing. It can be judgmental. I mean, how many people are saying, "Well, we're the right religion"? You get this all the time. Is there right or wrong, or is there just the oneness that is? And perhaps if we came to the table of diversity in love, we'd realize, hey, we have far more in common than we do differences in our beliefs. And yet religion can serve society and the world in a fantastic way. I mean, the Catholic Church, you look what the Catholic Church has done in I mean, who knows, hundreds of thousands, if not billions of dollars, for humanitarian aid, or I mean, even the refugees. I mean, if you look at, and I'm just, you're a good Catholic guy. So you look at the Catholic Church and what they've done to support that. That's fantastic. That's great. I think that's what churches, that's the role they fill. Spirituality is a personal journey. And I agree, that yeah, sometimes if we can lean into the personal connection to the divine instead of somebody else telling me what to do or how to be, that's where we find a true connection, whatever that divine is to you. I think that can also be a very personal journey. It's like, well, maybe it isn't a man with a white beard sitting on a cloud up there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more to it. Yeah.
I think so. People are so quick today to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I'm probably more or maybe secular Christian, if that's a thing. But, I really love I don't know if you're familiar with Jordan B. Peterson. He's a psychologist. But yeah, so his walkthrough of the Bible and the metaphorical and psychological meanings, like, yeah, that's my vibe right there. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting to listen to when he goes through and the stories and how he casts new understanding on stuff that you're never really taught by. I mean, because I think a lot of people aren't on that level to analyze things in that way in psychology. So it's really cool to listen to that. Not to divert back to the story, but so you were in the hallways experiencing this oneness with other people, and then you found yourself lying in the hospital bed. And then what happened from there?
Well, as I looked at my body, I knew I had to get back in. And again, we have no idea how powerful our thoughts are. I didn't have to figure out how do I get back in. It was the intention. It was the consciousness. It was I'm going back in, and then boom, I was back in the body. And yet back to the trauma, the grief, the guilt, the regret. I mean, it was so overwhelming. And, and like I say, I mean, I was ventilated. There was a big tube down my throat during the breathing for my lungs, and my legs were obviously immobile. My right arm was immobile. My left arm, they eventually tied down because I kept grabbing at everything. And, and then of course, gosh, I mean, there was morphine and I was in ICU, and this went on for weeks. So, that's all kind of a blur. However, there was times, and again, this might sound crazy, but I felt like my spirit would leave the body. I recall standing in the corner of the room, watching my body and what was going on, and just thinking, I just need a break. I just need a break from this.
I was going to say, that's got to be really draining psychologically to be going in and out of these experiences. Did you ever go back and kind of try to look at what was happening with your body to see what correlated with when you were bouncing in and out, or is that impossible because of the nature of your condition?
Yeah, I don't know what was going on with my body. That would be impossible. And yet I was so unconcerned about the body because the emotional grief was so much. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, that was the overwhelming part. I had a morphine button that I could hit with my working left hand. And I would hit that thing for the emotional release. Like, I just have to escape from the grief and the guilt and the trauma of what has happened here.
When was the moment where you could kind of start understanding, or where the morphine you weren't hitting that as much and you started to try to okay, I need to get up and get moving here? Did you have any more experiences as this was happening, or did they kind of tail off as your condition improved?
Yeah, I was pretty out of it. And I was in ICU, and then I would be in surgical recovery, and I was aware of that. I got off all the morphine and everything else, and they put me on different, things as it progressed. But then I had horrible infections. I threw pulmonary emboli, or the blood clots that lodge in your lungs. So I was from ICU to surgical recovery to ICU. And at the whole time, Spencer's at my little brother's house. And I mean, he didn't even get to see me for a while because they had to leave the abdominal wounds all open because of the infection. I mean, that was a mess. And yet, he would come in. But I did begin to heal. I mean, after all of that, then I was very alert, very aware. I was off of the heavy narcotics, and yet there was still a lot of healing and a lot of surgeries to be done. The most profound, out of body experience happened at the end of my hospital stay. And it's probably worth pointing out that the two most profound things were at the scene of the accident, before any morphine or narcotics had been administered. And then at the end of my hospital stay, when I was off of all the heavy narcotics, and I believe taking Tylenol for pain,
Did you ever run into anyone who, and I want you to tell us what happened with that vivid experience at the hospital. Right. Did you ever run into anyone who was like, hey, you were just experiencing this through heavy doses of medication? Do you ever have anybody say that to you, or is that just kind of behind your back type stuff? People will whisper. I mean, because I know you're out, you're speaking, guys are writing books. So do you have that kind of?
Oh yeah. Well, there's always the skeptics, Mm-hmm. And yet, I don't have any agenda in any of this anyway. There's nothing I'm trying to prove. It's like, here's what I experienced. But yeah, a lot of people will say, well, it was the oxygen that cut down to your brain, and then you hallucinate, and this is what happens when those chemicals are released in the body. And I get the chemistry of that, but wow, what I experienced was so real. Mm-hmm. And then there's skeptics out there, and I've had that all explained. And for me, it's like, okay, yeah, that may be a possibility, but boy, I know what I experienced, and I know how it changed me. Therefore, I'm holding on to that. Mm-hmm. that was life changing.
Well, go ahead, Spencer.
As far as I'm concerned, that's low hanging fruit. It's easy to try and disqualify experiences. But I think there's something to be said of dream states and certain experiences of that nature, that it's all too visceral. Like it's more real than your actual, I guess, reality, So.
Yeah. And I've read a lot with Dr. Bruce Grayson, different things, speaking to him. It's like, and even with the psychedelics, is like when brain activity decreases and levels start getting to where there shouldn't be any brain activity, the experiences are becoming more and more vivid and more ultra real. So it's like people try to use that as like ways to get around it. But it's like, well, I think the more they kind of uncover that science, the more it looks like that's not the case. So it's, yeah. But moving to that last experience you had before you left the hospital, what happened there? What did you experience?
Well, that was interesting, because I was in the rehabilitation wing. I was out of ICU and surgical recovery, and in fact, they had finally stabilized my abdominal wounds, and they had put a colostomy bag in, and so I was able to lay on my side, because I'd had to lay on my back for all that time as to not spill my guts out, right? Mm-hmm. I had laid so long on my back that the back of my head is rubbed bald. The hair was off of it. And yet at this point, I was finally able to lay on my side and sleep, and I was off the narcotics. And I felt that light come again. In fact, I was sleeping. I remember being conscious. It was strange, because it's like, wow, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm really restfully sleeping. I'm peacefully sleeping here. I haven't slept for months. I mean, I've probably fallen asleep, but I was aware that I was in a peaceful sleep. And that light, the same light that I felt as the accident, came and surrounded me. And it felt like I was rising above the hospital bed. And yet this time the light dispensed. It's like the light that held me was like a fog that just dispensed. And I was in an incredibly beautiful place. People say heaven, the spirit world, the other side. The only word that comes close to what I experienced is I was home. I was home. I was so welcome, so comforted, and I was alone. I began to run. And this is something that's difficult to explain too, but the physicality that I experienced was unique. I could feel the energy of the ground underneath my feet. I could feel the intelligence, in every cell, if it were, of my calves and thighs as I joyfully ran, thinking, I'm home. And I was whole. I had 2 legs and 2 feet, and I was whole. And that was beautiful too, because I wasn't whole in this realm of experience. And as I was experiencing all that, I had the knowing that I wasn't there to stay, that it was just a visit. And at the same time, there was this corridor off to my left, and I knew intuitively, I just knew I'm to go this way, and I did. And as I made my way down the corridor, at the end of it was a crib. And Griffin, who we lost in the accident, he was only 14 months. He had still been sleeping in a crib at the time of the accident. So I rushed to the crib and I looked in, and there was my little boy. And he was perfect. In fact, he was sleeping. He was peacefully sleeping. I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child, but I picked him up. And there was such a familiar weight and heat. When you pick up a little kid, and he was solid. And I was even marveling that. I'm like, wow, I must be out of the body, but how am I experiencing this in such a tangible, physical way? And I could feel him breathing, and I could feel his breath on my neck. And I leaned over, and this was just something I always did with the boys when they were little, but I leaned over and I smelled his hair, smelled the hair of my son. And I knew, even by the smell, I'm like, it's him. It's really him. I'm holding my little boy. And I began to weep. I just thought, how can I really be holding him? And yet it's so wonderful to really be holding him. And I began to cry, and I felt this presence coming up behind me as I held him. And it was an overwhelming presence. In fact, my conservative Christian upbringing, I'm like, oh, wow, that's God. And then the guilt began to come up. It's like, I'm in trouble. I'm in so much trouble. My little boy is here because I crashed the car. His life was cut short because I dozed off or overcorrected. And the guilt and this presence is coming closer and closer and closer, and the fear in me. And I had the thought as I held him weeping, I hope I can be forgiven. That was my thought, probably from my upbringing and conditioning. I hope I can be forgiven. And as soon as I had that thought, and this almost felt tangible too, these arms wrapped around us. I'm holding my little boy, and these arms just wrapped around and held us. And then the whole lid just came off. The first message was, there's nothing to forgive. Everything's in perfect divine order. And then what I've learned is the life review. I begin to see my life. And I was like, yeah, that was a mistake. And this divine being, God, if you will, said, there are no mistakes. What did you learn from it? And then I was like, well, yeah, but that was wrong. And I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. And what was communicated to me by what I call God was, that's your judgments of it, not ours. We love you. You are as precious to us as the little boy you hold. And to me, yeah, he was perfect. He was divine. He was beloved. He was everything. And yet I was feeling that magnified from this presence. And it was a very personal experience, but I also was very aware that rippled out to everybody, that every living soul was that beloved, was that cherished, was that honored, was that loved. I mean, it was incredible. And I learned again about choice. I mean, I'm at the point in my life where I think there's only one common rule, and that's free will and choice. We get to choose, But I was told I could exercise my will, and this was, the universe is so kind that it speaks to us in the language we'll understand, and that was my Christian, it's God's will, and I was told, we want you to have your will in this. And my response was, and when I say we, it felt like there was multitudes. I mean, I was being held, but there aren't words for what I experienced. Like the whole universe was supporting my life. And now God is telling me he wants me to exercise my will. And I asked the question, I thought it was your will be done. And it was communicated to me in this simple way. My will is your will. That's how much you're loved. My will has always been that you have free will. You get to choose. And it was proposed to me. He even shared, you can give me your son. You can hand him over. You can hand him over and exercise your will so it doesn't feel like he was dragged away from you. And in all that love and peace and beauty, I kissed my little boy and I gave him back. And then I woke up or came to myself in the hospital bed, you know, with all the injuries and everything else. But it shifted my view of what I believed God was too, because I was afraid I was going to be judged. Life was a test and I was failing. And in those beloved arms, I knew with crystal clarity that life is not a test, it's a gift. It's an absolute gift, and that we create it, and that the entire universe supports our experiences, that we literally perhaps contract to, even Tamara, my first wife, saying, I loved you enough to go, because that's what we planned on creating. You know, it opens a whole new Pandora's box of cosmic consciousness and questions, I suppose. But for me, it felt like all the answers were right there.
Yeah, that's what I've heard people describe it as, is when you're there, it makes perfect sense how it's set up, what kind of for lack of a better term, the game is like, it makes perfect sense. But when you come back, you remember that it made perfect sense, but you don't quite grasp that connection anymore. And has that been hard?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't want anyone to misunderstand. It's not like I had this horrible accident and I had these profound experiences and I was okay. No, we had a horrible accident. I had experiences, but I grieved as miserably as anyone grieves. And Spencer can chime in here, because I drew from my experiences. Gosh, I got to hold my little boy. My wife and I made a choice. I'm here to raise my son, Spencer, who's a grown man now. But Spencer didn't have any of those experiences. He had to trod that path with just the logic of a child.
Was that hard for you, Spencer? I don't know, when did he tell you kind of these experiences? I imagine it was when you were, always age appropriate, like what can a kid handle? How did your dad spread that information to you? And then how did you accept that? How did that work for yourself? And has it been kind of, when you've been older now, you kind of understand it? Obviously, I would imagine a little bit better.
Yeah, so I think, it was kind of tiered. He, as a child, he told me certain details, like I went to heaven and I saw your mom, and kind of in very simplistic terms. And I received it much like a binky, I suppose, it was very placative to me. But as I grew up and started to get, I don't know, maybe a little more angsty or cynical as a teenager, I really had to process it for myself. As I got older, we talked more about it, and I was, I'm sure before he wrote the book, he kind of gave me more in full detail what had happened. But, it was very staggered, and I think just kind of age appropriate what divulged to me.
Did you ever, because myself, it's like, for me, it's been a very faith in God and religion, especially as bad things kind of happen to you or people it's kind of like a wave that's up and down. Sometimes it's pretty dark and I'm like, oh, nothing makes sense. And then other times they're like, oh, there has to be something else, Did you ever have those feelings towards your dad's story? Were you ever like, kind of like prodding him and like really wanting to get details to like, did you ever have doubts? Have you gone through kind of those faith struggles? How has that kind of unfolded for you? And how has your dad's story played a role in that?
Yeah, we definitely had, like I mentioned, those angsty times. And when I was really just kind of going through the crucible of early adulthood, I really pressed him on it. And I think I didn't want to press too hard, just because I know there's always that aspect of, well, it's all in the mind, or you created it. And it's kind of that, I don't know, paradox, or it's something that we can't fully 100% prove these experiences are real, but, we can't necessarily disprove them fully either. So in how far I pressed them, I really did like press him on his experience and what he went through. But I think I didn't, I had a bit of sensibility, I guess, not to push too hard or to tear down his story, so to speak, just because of my love and my care for my dad. And also, I think ultimately what was at the heart of my anger was the fact that I didn't have this experience. It wasn't that I wanted to disprove it, but just that I was jealous that I didn't have an experience.
Oh, and how did you kind of handle that, Jeffrey? Did you feel that from your son, or?
Oh yeah. I remember those conversations. In fact, I remember at one point he kind of, and this was in early adulthood. He had, we had gone through the childhood. He was probably 19 or 20 years old, but he said, okay, so maybe you're deceived. Maybe it was the chemical reaction in your brain, or maybe you're making it all up, but I don't know you to be dishonest, And this was the heartbreaking thing. He said, if there's some God up there, if there's some universe that supports and loves me, they ignored me as a little boy, and I don't know verbatim, but it was kind of like I beat my knuckles on that door you call prayer or God, and I never got an answer. I begged for 12 years. I was 7, and to the time, I became an adult, I would pray and ask, I just want to see my mom. And he's like, I got nothing. You had this experience and I got nothing. And that was hard for me. I went home. I still pray. I went home and I said, okay, God, I'll give it all away. Give him something. This poor kid, and I don't profess to talk to God every day, but I got an answer that night. And the answer was, why are you judging your son? Don't you know his experience is perfect for the expansion of his soul? And it doesn't have to look like yours, and that it was just another very poignant reminder. And it wasn't a near-death experience. It was just it was a desperate prayer of a father, but the feelings came and the knowing came that you're judging him and you don't get to judge him. Your job's to love him. And you had an experience because that was perfect for your soul's expansion, and he didn't because that's perfect for his soul's expansion. And your experiences are as unique as everyone's life is unique. And yet it's all in perfect order for your individual growth and your individual path.
Yeah. And in hindsight, I don't think the price of admission is worth the ride, so to speak. Yes, we both went through a horrific accident, but, everything physically that my dad has had to go through and emotionally and psychologically and just everything, I don't think I would choose to have that experience. And I'm sure you wouldn't either, Dad, but I wouldn't
no.
experience that beautiful experience. I wouldn't choose to have such a beautiful experience at the cost of losing.
I get it. And and here again, it's interesting because I drew those things are what I survived on. The out of body experience is what I survived on. That's what got me through. Maybe I needed that because I'm a weaker soul than Spencer. Spencer didn't have the experience, but he still became compassionate. He still became mindful. He still became loving. He still became respectful without all that. So, the bottom line for me is we don't have to have a near-death experience to connect and to be awake, so to speak, to the divine connection we all have to each other and to the world and to the universe. And Spencer turned out a lot better man than I am. And so the experience maybe was just my cheat sheet to get me through life,
No, that's really well put, because I too, when my dad passed away, and I'm an older man now, so my mom has experienced some things that have been odd, like in terms of when people say, oh, somebody is communicating, like there's been some strange things in the house where we grew up and my dad, and I've had nothing. Haven't had any kind of experience. I've had no signs from my dad, and so part of me was like, what the hell, I would love to know that you're around, something subtle, whatever. So I had a little kind of anger about that, but to Spencer's point, that's really right. The price of admission is like, I think my mom has had it a lot more difficult losing my dad, who she's been with her whole life. and all the things that go with that and not having someone in the house anymore. I think that pain for her is much greater than mine with my children, and my house is full, and I've had, a lot of support in that sense where she's alone in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I think it's warranted, and depending on what your soul needs, to your point, Jeffrey, is what you get.
I think those that don't have the experiences are the noble and great ones. They're the ones that are so strong and courageous that they get through it. I mean, this is, Spencer and I just recently released this, what we thought was a children's book, but it's been embraced by anybody who misses someone.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the mystical, oh gosh, I was in heaven thing. It's like, okay, how do I move on every day, given the fact that it hurts and I'm grieving?
Yeah.
And it's beautiful the way it unfolds, written from his he wrote it just last year. So as an adult man, he wrote it, but from that 7-year-old perspective. The book is called Where Are You?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the experience. Where did you go? I mean, you probably experienced that with your dad, like you were here and now you're not. Where are you?
It's such a weird, I don't even know how to describe it, but I watched him die. Like I saw it all happen and stuff. And that was like just beyond anything you ever want to see. And what he said to me before it happened, and then it happened. And, your brain connects things that probably have nothing to do with anything supernatural or anything. But I remember the day, it was just when I woke up, it woke up, it felt different. It felt different. Like something was going to happen. Like something was like, I don't know, it was so strange. And then when it happens, like this huge hole and this silence in the house. And it's just like someone who's been an anchor in your life for so long and it's just gone. And it's just like such a weird undercutting of everything you believed, everything you felt like you knew. I mean, it's really, everybody experiences it at a different time, right? Spencer had it when he was 7, and then we had it when we were older. I mean, some people lose children, some people lose parents, some people lose siblings. So it's, there's nothing that teaches you more, I think, about yourself, your spiritual journey than that moment. And it's just an unfortunate price to pay, I think.
I love what you're sharing here, because we all get our turn. We all get our turn at some level. And yet we grieve because we love. Grief. I've also come to the conclusion, and it's funny. My book's called Knowing, and now it's like I don't know anything, and that's okay. that's perfectly fine. But the two things I've embraced is free will and choice is the cosmic rule, and that grief may be the most pure form of love we know. It may literally be the purest form of love we know is to grieve. We're supposed to grieve. It's okay to grieve. It's natural.
That's so well put. Did you, when you put your son, when you gave him back, did you and I know this maybe isn't that clear anymore, put him back in the crib? Did you hand him back to what you perceived as God? How did that transpire?
I handed him back to God.
Okay.
And yet I didn't dare turn around. I still had that condition. I was
going to ask you.
Fear. I didn't dare turn around. It was like, okay,
Yeah.
But there was so much love, it was really releasing him. I was giving him over. I was trusting and giving him over. And and then the next day it's like, why didn't I just hold on? Why didn't I just say no? I'm holding on to him.
Yeah, I was curious about how that affected you in terms of, because that's got to be like when you describe his weight, the smell of his hair. I smell my kid's hair all the time, so it really kind of got me emotional when I heard you say that before, and I was like, Jesus, like to know that's the last time you're going to do that. It's like just terrible. But you're confronted with this love at the same time.
Yeah, in a different state, I'd have fought. I'd have fought to hold on to him and not let him go.
Yeah,
it was my will, and yet in all that love, it was the perfect thing to do in that moment. And I've learned a lot from it. When you talked about us being divine, boy, for God to say your will is my will. And to feel that love, I came back thinking, wow, if there's any way I could ever show up as a manifestation of the love I experienced, well, that's what it's about. Here comes the tears.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. And I don't, can I show up for one person that way or 3? I don't know. And I struggle with that still. It's like, wow, as a father, and you've just lost your dad, and my heart goes out to you. My dad is still living. He's 88. He's in a wheelchair, and I go see him and we talk. His mind is good. His body's shot, but his mind. his mind's there. I'll have a whole set of different emotions, losing a dad, or a mother. My mother's still living. But it's this thing that just peels back the layers of our essence in a way that allows us to feel at a different level than anything else would ever allow us to feel at. And it might be relief. I mean, I was working with someone recently and they said, yeah, gosh, this uncle that abused me died and I feel relieved. And I'm like, good, then that's your grief. Mm-hmm. And that's love too. That's love too. You can let that go. You can forgive and you can love yourself. There's all different emotions, but boy, the catalyst seems to be when someone we care about or someone key in our life passes.
Do you think without that experience, you wouldn't be here today? I mean, was suicide ever a thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I begged my brothers to bring me a gun in the hospital when I got off the morphine, and I'm like, bring me a gun. I'm not doing this,
Jeez.
and that's, I mean, yeah. And had I not had, this is why I talk about the courage of a soul. If I hadn't had those experiences, I might be the guy strung out on a corner wondering what the hell happened. I mean, that was my anchor. And the love for my son, Spencer. That's why I came back. I knew I had a purpose, even if it was just, and that's funny too. People will say, well, you must have been spared for some grand purpose. And it's like, yeah, to watch Spencer perform in the jazz band, or to watch him in his rock band, or to hold my current wife's hand, or to play catch with my youngest son. We adopted 2 boys and we rebuilt a family. But those little things are the big things. That's the bottom line. Those little things really become the big things when we peel back all the facade.
Was that the last experience you had, Jeffrey? Was that kind of it? Or did you?
Well, no, I mean, I've had other dreams or visions, if you will. I mean, strange things where Tamara would come to me in a dream, or Griffin has come to me, not as a toddler, as a grown young man.
Oh, wow.
And so, there's a lot of questions. And I say, well, I don't know anything. And yet the bottom line is someone divine held me. I can't deny that. So although I do embrace that we are God, I was held by someone so loving and so overwhelming. That was the experience. So if that's God, I want to be like that. I mean, that was kind of the bottom line.
Do you still have doubts, or do you think that experience kind of enshrined that there is definitely something after, or do you ever still doubt?
I don't doubt. I mean, in fact, I have no fear of death. I mean, and I've talked about this too. It's like, okay, let's say, no, my experience was, wow, there's something after, and we're all connected, and this is going to be magnificent. However, maybe we need to make it magnificent here, not worry about what's after, what's going on today in my life. And let's pretend, for instance, for argument's sake, that there's nothing after, that we're biological organisms and we die and that's it. I'd still love to leave a legacy of love and acceptance and compassion. I mean, for me, that's where I'm at, but that might be because of the experience I had, if that makes any sense.
It does. How about you, Spencer? How's your doubt to belief ratio?
Well, it's kind of, I go, if I have a belief, I may understand that it is maybe not true and it is only a belief, but I kind of look at it more pragmatically of how do I live my life and how do I carry myself based on my beliefs? And so I think that attachment, if you will, to belief or to dogma or to religion, I've kind of let go of, or I have a very loose grip on it. Because for me, it is very much it's here in the here and now. And so, yeah, I don't, I'm skeptical, but I guess I'm not plagued by doubt, if that makes sense.
No, it does. That does.
I love that. I do. I love that, because so many people with my experience, they want to talk about the near-death experience. What's coming after? And now I'm at a point like, well, what's happening today? Let's not worry about what's happening sometime. Let's embrace what we can do to make the world a better place right now, here, with what we have,
And I don't want to kind of put words in Eben Alexander's mouth, but I'm pretty sure when I talked to him a while ago, he had mentioned that, and I think you kind of alluded to it, is that your soul chooses kind of what's going to happen, or the situation maybe down here on earth. You go through it to learn to grow as a soul. And then how do you couple that with free will? And like, what choice do we really have in terms of how our life, the trajectory is going? Maybe it's, like branches on a tree, like you'll come up to choices, but really you're heading toward one destination. How do you guys see that?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. And you're friends with all I love Bruce Grayson. Eben is a good friend. We've talked a lot about these things. He was adopted, and he's actually assisted me with our adopted boys. I'm
really cool.
I like to be adopted, so we don't really talk about the near-death experience, but I'll chime in. I'll give my answer. And here again, this is my answer. It doesn't mean it's the answer. We get so on this quest for the truth. Well, I don't know what that is. I know my truth. And for me, there's a plan. There's a master plan. When I was held in those arms, and I was told literally, because I was still asking, why, God, why? And what was communicated is you created it, and we loved you enough to support it. Why was because you wanted it, and all the players by Spencer sticking with you and walking with you even if you limp, and by Tamara and Griffin going. We supported your soul's journey. Now, so for me, there's a roadmap. I think individually we have a roadmap, but within that roadmap, there's always free will and choice. It's the dichotomy to me. Mm-hmm. Yep, there's a soul's journey, and we're not aware of it, so we don't remember and we forget those things. But there's always a choice. It was almost like the choice to come back. It felt like a choice, but I believe it was my roadmap. That was the soul's roadmap, and I chose to honor it, but I could have chose not to. And it wouldn't have been wrong. That's the thing. Judgment goes out the window. And when I was in the arms of God and worried about all this judgment, it's like, no. We love you. You're just there playing. We're just watching. And we're watching as you make choices and experience the results of your choices. And there was no judgment. The only thing is, what have you learned? What have you learned? What are you learning? Tell us what it's like to be you, because you're a manifestation of us. It was kind of like that. It's difficult to put in words, but that's in the bare essence of what it was.
For me, I don't know if life has a meaning, but I think it's much more powerful to move forward with purpose and kind of make your own meaning than it is to go down the path of nihilism or strong atheism, if that's a thing. I think it's very much better for yourself and for society to move forth with purpose, because, it's kind of hard to tell if certain things are just already set out for you and that's your path, and it's your destiny. But I think that can be a crutch to some people, almost saying, well, that's my destiny, or, we have to, I think, you've got to make your own path, but move forward knowing that there will be, or maybe even believing that there will be a better day tomorrow, because the alternative is not better.
Yeah, the times I've been in a really dark place in terms of belief or anything after, or is there a point to life? Is there a purpose? And then when the dark thoughts start creeping in, that is a really bad place to be. And not just from like, you're going to like commit suicide or something. For myself, it's nothing like that, but just like an emptiness, and you're just like floating through life with no direction. It's really, and you see people, and it's hard for me because you see people in some really horrific circumstances across the world, right? From suffering. And you can blame a lot of that on human beings, what we do to each other, from governments to just bad actors or whatever thing else. But there is still like diseases in born children and like genetic things and things that are just used. It seems to not have a cause from our point of view. And that's where it's hard for me to tackle that from like, there's a loving being who cares about us. How do you guys grapple with that? Maybe you're approached by people who come and hear you speak and they're like, hey, this is really rough. What about this? How do you approach that, and how do you reconcile that with like a loving God?
We may have, my dad once said, like, I don't think I was paying attention. I think I was talking to somebody else when we discussed and agreed upon this experience we call life, because I think if there is a loving God, because that's the thing people say all the time is, oh, this happened to me, or, this horrible thing happened, so there can't be a God. But I think if there is a loving God, he, she, it, God gave us choice. And so we are living the consequences of our choices. And that's, ultimately why I believe we just need to do what we can to make this world a better place, starting with ourselves and then rippling out into our families and our communities. Because that is the loving God that said, okay, you want this? Are you sure? All right, well, okay, let's play this game and see how it unwinds. But
I think it's interesting you bring that up, and this is just one thing that's assisted me, Scott. I mean, as I've because you kind of fumble around through it. After the experience, it was so easy for me to see the divinity in everyone else. I mean, gosh, I might pass a homeless stranger on the street and say, "Wow, look at that soul's journey." He took on more than I did. Look at the nobility and magnificence of that soul. And, it could be everything from the homeless person to the great leader or whatever. But the most difficult place for me to ever see the divinity was in the mirror, to ever look at myself and say, oh, I am that love. I am that manifestation in my very own unique way. And it doesn't mean that I have to go cure cancer or change the world. It simply means I get to be me. And by being me, I'm manifesting the divine. And for me, the key was the self-love, that empty hole you talked about when your father passed, and that emptiness. I had an empty, sucking hole in me for a decade. Mm-hmm. And even the story, well, God held me. God told me my will, that was all an external validation, right? The journey for me was the internal validation. When would I finally learn to love myself from within myself instead of from an outside source, even if that was God? When could I finally look in the mirror and say, you know what? I'm going to forgive the fact that I overcorrected the car. Mm. And that was easier to do for me because I had held my son. I'd said goodbye to my wife. It's like, they're there, they're okay. And someone might say, well, that's mental gymnastics just to get through that self-forgiveness. But it was so real. That was my cheat sheet to say, okay, at some point I've got to let this go. And I've got to embrace myself and love myself and forgive myself. And quite honestly, that's when it shifted. I couldn't write the book. I couldn't talk about it. I didn't do any of that in the first 10 years because I was still processing it and dealing with it. But once I learned to embrace myself as a divine being, then it was like, okay, this isn't about me anymore. The ego went away. It's like, this is about the experience and how it might serve others. And I don't care what people think. And they're going to think a lot of things. I get a lot of hate mail too, I mean,
I can imagine.
How can you say no judgment, or how can you do this, or wow, you fell asleep at the wheel, ignoramus. I mean, it's brutal. And
that's, yeah. I mean, people are, especially if you get into like the religious zealotry and people who want to grasp onto something so tight. I mean, we've seen it with stuff we've covered. As soon as you deviate, somebody will follow you because of a certain thing you said about religion, like they like it. As soon as you deviate from that and say something that counters it or something that's different, they'll attack you. So I can imagine kind of the garbage that you get. And not to glorify suffering, but would you say a life without it is meaningless?
Yes. I mean, I think we're here in duality. Now, here's the thing. Suffering is different than being miserable. We're all going to suffer. We came into this duality. In fact, I put it in this term. We came here to experience what we're not, that we might more fully embrace who and what we truly are, which is divine. So we're experiencing suffering and darkness and struggle and separation and all these things. That's all an illusion, based on my experience. But the illusion is a grand teacher. And I've learned so much more probably in my difficult times. I've learned so much more through struggle and pain than I perhaps did in a bright day. Maybe that's just I'm a thick skull and that's how I learn. But it plays a purpose. However, it's not our purpose. Our purpose is not to suffer. Our purpose is to embrace the joy. But we wouldn't know the joy without the pain, right?
I've had this thought a lot, is you're talking about forgiving yourself and kind of overcoming that. And then I think I heard you say something about some indigenous friends that you had talking about the flow of life and kind of moving with that current and not fighting it to make it easier. How do you get past that guilt? Because everybody has it, right? It might be something else. It might be various things that occur. Like my brother, when he was a baby, my parents took him to a babysitter who was actually abusive, and she ended up murdering another child. And my brother luckily wasn't in there. But for the family who we knew who had their child killed, the guilt is immeasurable. That you took him there, that you trusted this person, and this happened. How do you have any tips to get past that? Like I know it's a process, and I know you had kind of help maybe spiritually from the other side. For people who don't or people who do, like how do you move past that? I feel like it's such an intangible thing. You can't say like, hey, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. Now you're past it. Like how do you articulate that to people?
Yeah, and that's a tough thing too, because then there's the anger that they did this.
Yeah.
And that can be a repeating record. There's an interesting little book, and I didn't write this book. This is another, I suppose, children's book, just like Spencer and I were doing, but it brings light. It's Neil Donald Walsh wrote a book called The Little Soul and the Sun. Mm. And to me, almost like witnessing the nurse who passed me her abuse, and yet seeing the magnificence of what it had created within her. And then she was nothing extraordinary. She was a nurse, but wow, she was a nurse. I mean, that book was very helpful to me, just to point out that our experience is not forever. It's a school, and that maybe the worst things that happen to us, or the people that hurt us the deepest, are our most magnificent teachers. Now, that's tough to say to a parent who's had a child murdered. I mean, I get that. I'm not, wow, that's a rocky road. You must have really signed up for the full feature film when you said, I'm going to come and experience that. Mm-hmm. But maybe the lesson, maybe what you wanted. I mean, for me, there was nobody to blame but myself. I was the one like, how could you lose control of the car? But to realize that there's forgiveness, maybe that's what I wanted to learn in this iteration of life. Wow, I really want to learn to forgive. Okay, well, who's the hardest for you to forgive? Oh, I forgive pretty easy, but wow, I'm hard on myself. Okay, let's create a situation where at a very deep level, you get to forgive yourself. And like I say, it looks like absolute mayhem and catastrophe here. But is it the grandest support of a soul's journey that there is? I don't know the answers. But that swims around in my head, and the little soul in the sun made sense to me. It's like, wow, even the people that hurt me are angels. That we were given angels of all kinds to experience duality.
For me, emotions like grief and guilt, well, more so with guilt, are just of utility to help me learn, my lesson for next time. Like, okay, so I have guilt for this. Well, what did I cause? What did I do to bring about that guilt? And what can I do to never let it happen again? But I mean, it's so hard with like that question with the babysitter and murdering that kid. I mean, that's a damn hard lesson to learn. And maybe it's not a lesson to learn in the sense that maybe there was nothing you could do. Maybe there were no warning signs, that's why I was hesitant to answer that question. But in some cases, I think there is something for you to modify in your behavior or choices that you made that you can, faced with subsequent similar situations, you might choose to do something a little differently.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, for me, when I was asking all the why questions to God, and certainly when something like this happens, we ask why. How could that happen? How could a loving God allow that? I mean, let's go one step beyond the parents. I never found good answers to the why questions, but when I shifted it to what, what am I learning from this on a very personal level? That's where I found some healing. Okay, what have I learned? What have I learned? And when I was judging my life and God said, yeah, but what are you learning from it? I draw from that. Okay, so something happens and it might be catastrophic and horrible like that. Okay, what am I learning? Instead of why, the why was a downward spiral of darkness, but what am I learning and what can I do about it now is where I found some peace.
That's really well put. I think for me, just in looking at my dad's situation, it was, and I didn't get to that point for a while because it is a why and like, this is unfair and like, this is not fair to him or my mom or whatever. But if you get to the what, and for me, I think it was recognizing that time was so precious and important and to appreciate every single moment that you have because it's fleeting and you don't know when it's going to be gone. And from my family to my kids to friends. And so far, I think that's what I've come away with because you can say it, you go, oh, time, but you don't really get it until something like that happens.
Wow. Bottle that up and sell it because that's beautiful. Wow. This hurt. And I learned that every moment is sacred and a gift. That's precious. That's fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, I remember him laying there and it was just like, just nothing else mattered. Like everything melted away. I didn't care what I had. I didn't care what job I had. I didn't care how successful I was, how much money. Nothing mattered. It was just like, what do I remember doing with that man right there who I'm not going to see again?
Yeah.
And it's just, I won't get emotional, but
no, I unless you do. And based on my experience, you will see him again. It might be in a dream or a vision, or it might be a faint feeling. Gosh, I thought of Dad today. For me, when those happen, they're near. They're right there near us. Our new book, Where Are You? That's the thing, is they live on within us. They're really not gone. They live on within us. And your life and your manifestation is your Dad living on in you and through you. And you honor his life in being you because you're a part of him, just like we're all a part of, the grand consciousness of what we call the divine, right?
Mm-hmm. Spencer, was there any anger when you're growing up for kids, for other families who maybe have had things happen, who've either lost someone and they have children who are kind of dealing with this stuff? I imagine it's immensely complicated with children's psychology and them trying to like deal with this, and how you, Jeffrey, kind of helped your son along on this path. For families who maybe have had these things happen, is it getting your child help, getting them to talk? Like, how does that unfold? How did that unfold for you? And how does it unfold for most families when you guys have kind of looked into this kind of thing?
Well, I remember as a kid, it was, I think it was the first Mother's Day after the accident. And I remember them doing something in Sunday school to bring home to your mom. And, I could have thought, I could have had a better perspective on it and thought, oh, well, I'll give this to my aunt because she's taking care of me and she's kind of like my mom now. But, I just felt deeply hurt. Like, who am I going to give this to? I don't have a mom to give this to. And I think growing up, there was similar examples of that where it was just this feeling of not being understood and people not. And, like I didn't tell them, it wasn't their fault that they didn't know what had happened to me, but it was just kind of this, like, you don't understand what I've gone through and it's not fair. But I don't think it was manifest, it was kind of, I hadn't quite been able to, it wasn't tangible, it was there, but it was in my subconscious. I wasn't fully aware of it.
And did you have any, I'm sure it's different for everybody, but you see this with different. I saw this with a family we knew actually, when your dad started having feelings for another person and then a new life and kind of new siblings. Was that tough for you? Is that tough for? I imagine that's tough for children. Depending on, on one hand, you're getting kind of a restart and a fresh and more love and more family coming together. Was that hard for you though? That transition? Did you feel like any kind of mixed feelings about that, or was it pretty relatively smooth, the progression of that over years?
Probably I had some mixed feelings, but I think more or less I kind of, I accepted it wholeheartedly just because I wanted to move on from the accident. I didn't, and part of my covering it up and not dealing with it is I just wanted to like get back to normality, so to speak.
And was that hard for you, Jeffrey? Did you notice that you had to like do anything in particular? Because I know you're dealing with healing yourself and your grief, and then also caring about your sons and how he's processing it.
Yeah.
Was this like a tough, long process?
It was incredibly hard. I mean,
Yeah.
let's be honest. It was incredibly hard. What is this dynamic of bringing more people in? I remember when Spencer was young, he was like, don't talk about it. Don't tell people. He wanted normal. And I didn't know what normal was anymore. So it was difficult. And even in hindsight, you're like, wow, how did we survive all that? Even a new relationship and a new marriage, and then adopting, additional children, all of it almost feels like a dream sometimes. It's like, how did that ever happen?
Yeah, how did I get here?
Yeah, how did I get here? And I think that's kind of where I am. Well, I'm here now. So let's do the best we can with today. It's every family's different, every person's different. And just love's the most powerful thing in the universe. If we can infuse everything we do with love somehow, even if it's grief, we'll get through it. There will be the sun come up tomorrow,
How do you guys feel about reincarnation? And you talk about the soul coming and going. Do you feel like we come back again, or once we're gone and we stay there?
In my experience, I was an eternal being. I mean, suddenly I'm in the arms of God and I'm eternal, just like what I always thought that was. I'm totally open to reincarnation. I'm totally open to, hey, we're going to have lots of lessons and lots of different things to learn. So I'm completely open to that, very much so.
I know that was echoed by Eben Alexander as he went in with kind of a traditional Christian background and came out with like reincarnation and different ideas that he said he had no previous understanding of or acceptance of. So I always thought that was interesting because you hear that echoed quite a bit by people who move out and kind of the eternal soul.
I think reincarnation makes more sense than, you live and then you die and then you're in heaven for all eternity. But then what are you doing? Like where is it going? And that's kind of a bigger question I ask sometimes to myself. I'll say like, where there's a life after death, where is it all going? And that's, I can kind of really start overthinking it all.
Yeah, it could be eternal lives. It could be eternal lives. If God is love would say, hey, you get all the chances you need. You get second chances. You get to go back and retake the test every time you want to. That seems to make a lot of sense to me in a universe of love and compassion. It feels a little bit difficult, which comes from my upbringing, that we get one shot at it, and if you mess it up, too bad. Sorry.
Yeah.
Now in the Christian realm, well, you've got this Jesus, and he can make it right, and that's great. But there's also a flip side of that, which means I'm of no worth. I'll never make it on my own. I'm of no worth, and that's good, humble thinking, I suppose. But my experience shifted that a lot. It's like, wow, we're all of great worth, and we're all loved. And we're here to walk as the divine beings we are, not as broken sinners. And almost in shifting that in my mind, I could look in the mirror easier and say, okay, I'm just learning. I'm just here to learn. And yeah, I've messed it up a dozen times and more, but I'm learning and I'm improving and I'm moving forward and my soul's expanding. And that's the love that is God to me. And so if it's many iterations, well, that's love to me.
Mm. Well, and it goes back to my original point is like, if I'm of no worth, or if Jesus is just going to save me, well, then what's the point? I think it's better, let's not get narcissistic now, but let's, I think it's much better to move through life knowing that you do matter and that your actions matter, and that you can make a difference, and you can live out the world. You can create the world that you want to see just by your own actions. And even if they're, or at least if they seem of no consequence, it's much better to move forward in life, thinking that you matter. But in the smallest terms, we do matter. We are of some consequence. We have our actions influence others around us, and then that, how that affects them influences the people in their lives, and it shoots out way more than I think we could comprehend. Just one little small choice or how we treat someone. We do matter.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, it's not about, I'm still a Christian. Like I mean, Jesus is my guy, my master. But when I've really looked into it in a different framing, what he was teaching was that we are divine. Mm-hmm. If you've seen me, you've seen that. Walk on the water, Peter. Why are you doubting? Greater things will you do than I. All these biblical verses of what, an enlightened master like Jesus was teaching may be far different than you're no good and you're never going to make it. Does that make any sense?
It does. And it brings me to a question that I've asked some of the others is there a hell? Is there a darker force that opposites God? It appears in a lot of different religious teachings, a lot of different traditions. I think a lot of people who come back from NDEs talk about love and acceptance. And some people do report darker NDEs, and then they maybe change their life based off that. How do you guys fit that into this, I guess, newer picture of God, in your case, Jeffrey, and then maybe Spencer from this like studying and kind of evolving? How do you guys view that?
Here's the interesting thing. If we're divine beings and we're creating our lives, we create our own heaven and our own hell. I've put myself right in hell a few times in my life, beyond getting in the crash. Well, I created it. I'm accountable for it. The devil didn't make me do it. I made a choice and I experienced some horrible things because of it. On the other hand, well, I made a choice and, we say, well, God smiled upon me or supported me or blessed me. True, but it's all blessings. Once again, the duality is the school. So what we see as darkness, is it really, or is that just the duality that shows us what light is? That's kind of where I'm at with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for me, hell is just like darkness is the absence of light. Hell is the absence of purpose, the absence of us mattering. It's just the lack of that of God or whatever you want to call it, but it's the lack of purpose. It's the nihilism. It's nothing matters. It's everything's pointless. Like that to me is a hell that we see on this earth, and we see in just lots of places where people have played that out.
When I was talking to Dr. Kelly, I asked him kind of a similar question because I guess, from what you guys have heard, and when I talked to him, it's like he believes that it's possible to potentially access higher levels of consciousness. And some people do that, and that's why you see psychic phenomena and different things. But I did ask him, should you be careful? And he did reference some things, like he wasn't sure if there was things out there that don't have your best interest that kind of can influence and kind of manipulate. How do you guys feel about psychic phenomena? How do you feel about those things? How do you feel about people trying to contact past relatives? Because I'm sure that happens, with these stories, is people try to get a medium and try to talk to somebody. We did a psychic once, kind of for fun, to like see what it was about. We filmed it, and I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, I do lean certain ways in terms of, people can be charlatans and trying to take advantage of it. Does that talent really exist with some people, whether that's God's gift or something like the Christians would teach, something darker is at play? What do you guys feel about that?
There's some wonderful gifted people out there. There are some very gifted people that have psychic abilities. I mean, Ed Kelly would support that. He studies this and researches it. Mm-hmm. For me, I have my own answers and I have my own way of connecting. I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying, for me, I wouldn't rely on that. Now, part of this again might be the cheat sheet of that experience, but I've done this many, many times with people. You can connect with a loved one, write them a letter. They're not dead. They're alive and well, just in a different realm. Write them a letter. Write a letter to the person you love and really pour out your heart. What is it that's on your heart? And then be still and turn it over and let them write a letter back to you. And when I say that, just what are the words that come in your consciousness? What do you remember they would say? What did you do? And I've seen people write powerful letters with very profound answers, and it was all within themselves. They didn't have to go to someone else to get the answer. And I think, in the instance of your dad, well, Nobody knows your dad as well as you do in your relationship with him. So be still and listen, and you might have a feeling or a thought. It's very subtle. I mean, it's very subtle. It's not like, it's not like a megaphone voice, or it's a feeling. Here's a little experiment, and I'll be brief about this. Go to a quiet place. And I pray, but I pray differently. I used to pray and, oh, bless me with this and forgive me for that. And bless these people and watch over all of those. And I'm not belittling that. Now I shut up and listen, and I've made it not about me. And this is the subtlety I'm talking about. When I ask, what can I do for someone else today? Almost immediately I get ideas. A face will come up. I mean, it might be as simple as I need to text mom. Haven't talked to my mom for a week. I got it. That's inspiration. That's psychic ability. That's connecting to the oneness and making it very, very practical about what can I do for someone else. And that's when I found I could tap into the subtleties, if you will, when asking for others, not for me.
That's a really good point. Go ahead, Spencer.
I just second what he said. I agree a lot with what my dad said. I don't understand. I originally said I don't know to that question because I don't know what you might be, whatever forces you might be playing with, or, because I don't know if I necessarily believe in supernatural stuff, but I'm not closed off to them either. So I would be careful as to how you're going to get that information. There are people with gifts, but at the end of the day, like my dad said, I think we all have the ability to tap in to connecting with our loved ones. And that resides within all of us.
When we did it, there was a couple things that happened. It was like a Ouija board, but it was like the chalk kind. So there's like I think a planchette or whatever you call it. There's like a piece of chalk. And then I had all my friends there, and the thing was moving, and it started moving very rapidly. And I swear to God, nobody's admitted to doing it. And it was, I can't to this day articulate how that was happening. I know some people want to say it's subconscious and your bodies are moving it, but it was just like, it was bizarre. So most of it, I was just like, I feel like you're reading the room a little bit. But that instance was like, this is weird. I don't think I want to do that again. Because it was spinning circles like a vortex. And then we looked it up later. I was like, nah, I'm not going to play with that anymore. Because I go back and forth. Like sometimes I think it's BS. Sometimes I think, hey, there's something to that. You talk to Edward Kelly and it's like, hey, they're sounding like there's something to that with the studying they've done and kind of some tests they've done on subjects. So I'm same Spencer. It's like, I don't know. I have doubts, but at the same time, I don't know. I'm not confident to dabble in that. And I wouldn't recommend anybody go to a meeting and go, I want to talk to my dad, and then talk through that other person. Like to your point, Jeffrey, that letter thing is I think a brilliant idea. And I think I might try that when I feel like sobbing,
No, and it's nobody's business. The letter's for you. You do that in private and whatever comes through. And there's many things there. Yeah, it's, and you brought up an interesting point too, how you felt like you were doing this experience with the Ouija board or whatever it was. And you thought, that doesn't feel right to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, trust your instincts, and it might be great for someone else. But for me, it's like, trust your instincts, whatever your heart tells you. I'm not going to do that again. Okay, great. Let's move on. I learned again. What did I learn? Well, I learned that doesn't work for me. I'm going to do something different next time. And that's the beauty of life and free will.
Yeah. And for me, I'd analyze it and say like, okay, why, what felt wrong to me, or why does it not feel right? I'd maybe try and dig in just a little more to see what exactly felt off about it.
Mm. I know you mentioned it briefly, Spencer. Psychedelics, I guess you don't have to say if you tried it or not. Some people want to be kind of candid about it. Others don't really want to let that out. But is that something that you guys have come to understand a little more in depth? Or how do you feel about that? What do you feel like? Because a lot of people will describe that as being a non-traumatic way, like in terms of like you're saying, the price to pay to have that experience. You can have that experience through these drugs that kind of knocks out the connection of the mind and the brain to where you can kind of get a little insight into what's unseen, what's after. How do you guys feel about psychedelics?
Yeah, it's a great, like you said, it's kind of like you can gain those insights of oneness and connection through meditation, and you can kind of learn to detach a little bit from things that you maybe have an unhealthy attachment to through more long-term techniques. But I think like with the psychedelics, it's an easy way to just, shoot you right out of your body and into other experiences. But I think, long-term, they're not maybe the best. And I think a lot of people can go to them just using them recreationally, and maybe it's not the right, setting. It's not the right setting to get whatever therapeutic process they're looking to get from it. Or maybe, like in my experience, I wasn't even necessarily looking to have a therapeutic experience. I was just doing them out of recreation or for fun. But I think there's something there that needs to be researched more, and even I think more ancient cultures were very careful with their use of them, and it was a very sacred experience. But I don't think we should just shun them and say they're bad. I think the war on drugs was a horrible thing overall, and we've set ourselves back in the research that we could have gained from them.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I don't have a lot of experience with psychedelics, and yet many have said, well, your near-death experience is like an LSD trip, and maybe it is. I don't know. But I do have circles of, some indigenous people, who make it a very sacred ceremony, whether that's ayahuasca or psilocybin or peyote, or, there's a lot of indigenous cultures that have used this to open up that mind's eye, to open up the vision, if you will. So I have no judgment of that at all. I do agree. Yeah, let's not go out and get high for fun. But if there's a sacred, process and purpose, and I would also, and this is probably just me playing the responsible party, I guess, but I would do that with someone you trust. I wouldn't just go, I wouldn't just go sign up. And I mean, if someone were to, be interested or be called is what I've heard the term. If you were called to the medicine is what I've heard some indigenous shamans and medicine people say, then it is a sacred thing. And it isn't just an experimental recreational thing. And yet I don't discount or judge those at all. I think that they may be far more beneficial than we give them credit for. And also maybe far better for us than big pharmaceutical, drugs. That's my feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was talking to Dr. Kastrup, he had echoed this similar thing, is like not to approach it cavalier. You need to be at a point in your life where you're asking the right questions to actually have a full experience and to really gain insight. And he was talking about ego death and a whole bunch of other things, but he said if you just waltz in there with like, you're 20 or whatever, and you've experienced nothing in your life and you're doing it for fun, you might not have that transformative experience, and two, you can kind of maybe mess yourself up a little bit. Before we go, is there anything that I've missed that you guys want to highlight in your books and your stories that you feel would be beneficial to people listening? Or, I mean, again, I urge everybody to check out your books. I think they're fascinating. I think having people on like yourselves is so enlightening because people can get bogged down in life, work, problems, bills, and it just gets really kind of, you don't necessarily think about, like you said, I wake up and I think, what can I do for someone today to experience, so they experience that love. And I think like that's transformative. It's so simple, but it's so hard to do for people. Any last thoughts for people listening and maybe who are going through a tough time?
Yeah, I'd just say, not to be cavalier or cliche, but live in the moment. And that is to say, like, be fully aware of how you are perceived by others or how you are, functioning, and be aware that time is fleeting. And so it truly does come down to, what you do in this moment and then the next moment and the next moment. And it's I think that's where tragedy can teach us that, in a hard way, but it can teach us that, nothing is forever. And we truly do, need to embrace what we do have and cherish it. And I don't know, utilize it to, its utmost function. It's just, we don't know what we have until it's gone. And it's just sometimes you have to step outside of the monotony of your daily life and think about the bigger picture things, like, have I spent enough time with my family? Have I called this or that person? It's just kind of, sometimes you just have to pull yourself up out of your monotony of life and think of kind of the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's great. And yet, if in the moment you're in, it's traumatic, my only closing statement would be to choose joy, choose to see joy, because we're all going to have our turn at the opposite of joy. But if we can focus on what we're learning and know that it will get better, and make a choice. It's a choice. I will choose to see the good. I'll choose to ask what I learned instead of focusing on what I lost or the hurt or the damage. Then I'm choosing joy and moving forward in a process of positive expansion instead of getting stuck in the rut of the same record playing over and over again.
Yeah. Well, very well said, you guys. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's lyrics from one of my favorite Rush songs is, if you failed to make a choice, can't paraphrase it too well, but if you fail to make a choice, you've still made a choice. So inaction is still a choice. So it's much more empowering to say, I'm going to do this and then carry on with that action.
I like that. And then lastly, where people want to know more about you, I know your books, you can find them on Amazon. Any websites that you would like people to check out?
Yeah, go to Envoy Publishing, ENVOY, means messenger, but envoypublishing.com. The books are there. There's links to Amazon. There's videos there. We're on social media. You can find me at Jeffery, JEFFERYC. That's my middle initial, Olsen, and Olsen is OLSEN. But Knowing's there. Where Are You are there. They're both available on Amazon. Write us an email. You can go to the website at Envoy Publishing and write us an email. We read those and answer them. So we're open.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeffery. Thank you, Spencer. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for sharing your story, being candid about everything and answering all these questions. I really do appreciate the time, even selfishly for myself and what I go through. And I'm sure a lot of other people are listening, try to translate what you guys have gone through and what you've learned to their own lives. So I thank you enough. Can't thank you enough for that.
Scott, we send blessings.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, losing your father, I don't know what that's like. I won't pretend to know how that feels, but we send, just know that we send love, and we're honored to be on your show and reach out if we can do anything at all for you.
Thank you again.